Welcome to the Academy of Esports podcast. I am your host, James O'Hagan, and today I am here with Alex McNeil. He is the founder of McNeil Admissions, and he also hosts the subreddit ApplyingToCollege. Alex, thank you for being a guest on the Academy of Esports podcast today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being such a willing guest. I know you have worked in the past with Uni Esports, but you're on to a new project right now around helping kids find their place and their way in the collegiate scene through applications, and working as a private admissions consultant, which I know working with a lot of high school students, sometimes they just look at their local choices or focus in on their known universities when really there might be some diamonds in the rough. But before we dive too much into your work, we want to make sure that our guests know a little bit more about you that are maybe not related to the conversation that we'll have today. So first question that I want to ask you, Alex, what is a game, and it doesn't have to be a video game, that stands out as having been important to you at some point in your life, and why was that experience meaningful?
Okay. Well, probably the most meaningful game I've ever played was definitely World of Warcraft, because all throughout high school, the World of Warcraft was pretty much how I made all my friends in high school. And those are friends that I still have today. Like my core group of friends, we all kind of bonded over WoW. So yeah, that was great. Also, WoW was definitely my first esport experience. Actually, not really. Like Frozen Throne, Warcraft 3 Frozen Throne on Battle.net, but then World of Warcraft, like Arena, doing duos with my former business partner, Jesse Bedoni, and good friend. So that's got to be World of Warcraft Arena for me.
All right. And I know I have a really good friend. She is somebody who you would look at and go, this isn't a Warcraft person, but she is absolutely a Warcraft person. She's that kind of person where if you get started in the game, she's the one you want to hook up with to be in her clan, because she will help you level up quickly.
Oh, yeah.
It's always good to have those friends.
We're talking the days before gaming was cool or socially acceptable. We came up with a whole code word to talk about WoW, and we had our own like secret language so no one would know we played. It was very like insecure high school times. But
well, and maybe this is related to your Warcraft experience, but it may be totally eccentric or quite traditional. What is your superpower? That thing that you do better than most people, or what do you wish you could do?
Interesting. My superpower. I feel like something I'm pretty good at is writing very fast and pretty polished. That's like something I can do. I kind of churn out huge amounts of written content in short periods of time.
So your power is you're the Jack Kerouac of writing things long scroll as On the Road was written.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
All right. That's a very cool superpower, I would say. I wish I could do that with my dissertation.
Comes in handy with a thesis dissertation for sure.
All right, here's third question. Name one song, whenever it hits your speakers, you're going to sing along to it.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Doesn't have to be singing well to it.
Let's see. I was driving today, and I was listening to a throwback R&B station, and No Diggity came on, and I found myself singing along to that. I like that song.
This was not KMEL, was it?
It might have been. Yeah, it probably was.
So Alex lives in the Bay Area. I'm from the Bay Area, and KMEL has always been the station that plays that kind of music. So, Okay, fair enough. Now, and here's kind of leading into our conversation, and this is the fourth question. The one thing about your field that surprises people when they first hear it, again, now you're working with college admissions, private consulting in this field. What's something that surprises people when they first hear about it?
When they first hear about it? Well, I would say that people are almost always surprised when they a big thing in college admissions is rankings, and there's a lot of decision making that goes down based around like questions about prestige and school ranking. And I think when I start talking to families or students, like everybody is inevitably surprised when they start to think a little bit more closely about what factors actually contribute to, for example, like US world news rankings, which end up being really shallow and kind of like gameable. So I would say that that's not the most sexy response, but when people start to think what is actually behind the kind of curtain, the prestige curtain, usually they have like, they go, do complete 180s about where they think they want to go to school and for what reasons. Yeah.
Well, I found when I was looking at colleges, and maybe you can speak to this, again, growing up the Bay Area, had great college availability in the Bay Area, whether that was Berkeley, Stanford, but there's also the amazing community college system.
Yeah.
Around my area where I live now in Racine, Wisconsin, we have a lot of students who go to Gateway because the cost is right. The credits transfer very easily to a UW system, University of Wisconsin system. Mm-hmm. Are there students who you meet with or talk with who you look and go, have you considered this option first?
Yeah. So I too am a community college product. There's construction going on in the background. I don't know if that's super loud, but
no, we're good.
Quiet down. And I went, my higher education journey was kind of a circuitous one. Like I took a gap year after high school because I didn't want to go to college right away. Went to community college for 2 years in 2 different states. One was in Oregon, one was in California. And then I transferred and, applied to a bunch of different schools, like almost went to a UC, but I instead went to a private 4-year school, small community college, but a private 4-year liberal arts college in Washington. And then, of course, I did my grad degree at a public institution at San Francisco State. So I've kind of been all over the place. And there are definitely students, especially when I'm talking to someone who is like pretty uncertain about what they want to study or what they're interested in, or just generally uncertain about whether they belong in, an academic setting, whether that's what they want to do after high school. And then I would say the third person I talk to and kind of recommend community college a lot to are folks who need a better financial solution for school and who don't want to go into deep debt to get their education. And that I think is like more and more on my mind. Like I feel like I was lucky that I wasn't ready to get a 4-year degree after high school, because it sort of forced me to go to a community college, and the outcome of that was ultimately like I got a lot more clarity, but I also took on no debt. And the debt that I missed has probably been the like most important, I don't know, like one of the most important material factors in my life. Like it's given me so much freedom and autonomy and just flexibility to be entrepreneurial and just kind of to make my own decisions without having to worry about like a $700 a month, student interest payment. And I think student loans, like that's a crisis right now. It's something that we're failing to find a solution to, that, the Biden administration has basically promised some form of loan relief and has completely failed to deliver on that promise. And yeah, the student loan epidemic right now is a crisis. I mean, it's one of the biggest debt crises we face.
It's approximately about it's a little over $1 trillion right now, right?
1.8 trillion. It's almost
1.8 trillion.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and considering too that I know a lot of students had their debts put on hold during the pandemic. In fact, we're still under a moratorium, I think, until May.
Yep.
It seems like they keep kicking the can down the road on when those payments are going to restart. I'm sure that there have been some people who have lived now for almost 2 years without having to address their student loan debt in some way.
Yeah.
Because they're financed by the federal government. They're not going through a private company, who have realized just how many changes they're going to have to, hopefully they're going to have to make in the next few months, realizing that now there is, as you said, a potential, several hundred or even $1,000 of debt that they have to now service coming up here. But I know we're not here to dive into the depths of student loan debt, but let me ask you this, because we talked too about the promise of esports and scholarship opportunities too in a lot of these conversations. One of the big promises around esports is, look at these colleges who want to provide scholarships. But as I try to tell people, the scholarships are great, a $7,000, $5,000, $3,000, whatever the number may be. But ultimately, too, we have to consider that there's a lot more cost. These aren't full ride, football and basketball scholarships. A lot of these schools are private universities that are doing this, especially small colleges that usually have, tuition fees in the $20,000 to even $30,000 range. Has the esports scholarship really helped some students, or has it only, I guess, lessened the load of debt that a lot of students have seen from your experience?
So I would say that it falls more into the latter category. Something that, so my background in esports, my business background with James, you mentioned this company, Uni Esports, is a consulting company that I co-founded. And our focus was entirely on helping colleges and universities build esports programs, whether it was a varsity program or a rec program. And it was a fascinating experience because, we worked with probably about 100 or more schools over the time we were doing that work. And when you're coming into a university community from the outside, like as a consultant, you get a lot of information, usually at a pretty high level, about, what the goals of the institutions are. And especially if you're in a niche like collegiate esports, you learn a lot about why schools are investing in this kind of program during a time in higher education when, labor is underfunded. There's kind of systemic underfunding of student services. So it can really make a lot of folks scratch their head and say, okay, why are we prioritizing resources in this direction? And it is a challenging question. And what you sort of realize is that for most schools, for many schools that are experimenting in collegiate esports, there is a sort of happy alignment between the ability of esports to engage, a new constituency of students who don't have a place on campus all of the time. Gamers are very, marginalized, not really treated as a group that, deserves attention and resources. So it's redressing that gap, which is really great. Mm-hmm. But another huge reason schools are investing in esports is to use a program to attract students who might not otherwise come to their schools. So esports programs and scholarships are really, most of the time, do not address or even, bring students very much closer to being able to pursue a degree in a way that doesn't result in debt. And I think, honestly, like there are a lot of programs that end up being somewhat predatory because they lure schools in or students in with the promise of being able to, be a gamer while you study. And maybe that student isn't prepared for school, or maybe they, accept a spot at a school, they, get recruited, even though there's only $500 of scholarship money on the line. So I do think that esports on the collegiate level, is a kind of long-winded answer, but it's flourishing in a larger context of schools being in an enrollment crisis, and in a larger context of a student debt crisis that's going along with that. So it's complicated.
Well, because I know, again, a lot of students found through the pandemic, we have high school students especially who have gone now for a few years of being remote learners or online learners. Are on-campus experiences I guess, under more pressure now that students have figured out, hey, I can do my general ed studies from a community college system anywhere in the world. I don't even have to step onto campus. I know there's been an arms race, if you will, of some of the community college systems of really upgrading facilities over the last several years. Is there now an arms race, if you will, that is suddenly looking more precarious because students have figured out, hey, I can do this from anywhere in the world. I don't need to be here?
Yeah, I would say, people will usually say, well, it's a balance. There are trade-offs. Obviously, the in-person experience is essential to a college education. There's community. I think that's true. But I do think that we are rapidly moving in a direction where higher education is seen as instrumental for students. That is like, it's a means to an end of, this is my somewhat cynical or jaded view, but in the discourse today, a lot of the time, higher education is a means to an end of getting a good paying job, and getting a good paying job is a means to the end of having a satisfying or good life. So people make this equivalency between getting a degree, having a good life, and the thing that's in the middle there is the well-paying job. So to answer the question, I think that students are approaching education with a sort of efficiency mindset, right? They're trying to figure out how they can get the most bang for their buck. And that means, I think, paying less, having just a higher ROI, whatever that looks like. Could be going through a community college, finding a state school that has a really strong, CS emphasis, or some sort of, internship program that's built into the curriculum. And I do think that schools that rely on that sort of field of dreams approach, right? Like where their campus is extraordinary and it's all about the in-person experience, like liberal arts colleges, they're having a little bit of a hard time right now landing on their feet, especially during the pandemic.
Well, and again, this kind of dovetails into a question around technology and the use of technology. Again, as some students have either had a love relationship with online learning or a hate relationship with online learning. Well, what are some of your concerns about the roles of the technology in our lives, or specifically in the young people's lives in this search for that, I guess, ROI, if you will?
Yeah, well, I definitely feel that so much of the best part of a learning experience does happen in person and in a community. So I fear that, like, the new normal of higher education delivery, which is at least partly like it focus on, remote learning, asynchronous learning. I think that caters to students who might come from non-traditional backgrounds, or be, working while they're pursuing higher education. So that's a big plus. But I do think that the kind of inherent community-oriented quality of a higher education is maybe a little bit more under threat. The other things I think are, like, a lot of the technology providers that are facilitating higher education today, and especially in the last couple of years, those are private companies. And I don't particularly like this sort of deepening interpenetration of public higher education with private ed tech. I think that is not the best, generally speaking.
Well, when we talk about ed tech, what we're talking about are the products and services. For those of you who don't know, the products and services related to technology that we use in our schools. I know Google Apps has been one that we have used for a long time, and there are concerns around data privacy of our students around that, though Google tells us they don't do anything with student data. Apple has had a long-term affair with the education system as well. Microsoft, of course, but then there's the other companies. Zoom up until recently was really a kind of niche product, but now Zoom has made their ways into the education field as well too, even though it's literally, a a video conferencing service that we've already had access to through Google Apps for Education, for example. But what has this done, or what do you hear about when it comes to this and it's related to mental health issues in our schools or our communities, whether it's the collegiate, and what does that mean to you professionally or personally?
Yeah, so I do think that coming from a college admissions angle, and especially, so yeah, like you mentioned, the Applying to College subreddit. For those who don't know.
Please talk about that a little bit more, because
it's kind of relevant. So it's it's a 690,000 student community. It's the largest community in the world of students who are actively applying to schools and who are in the process of the application. And it's not just seniors, it's also honestly, there's students who are on that subreddit who are as early on as in 8th grade. And moderating that subreddit, you get a lot of perspective about the kind of peaks and troughs of mental health, like crises that kind of fluctuate throughout the year, across years, and like get more and more intense every year, right? Like I think that we're definitely in a cycle where the mental health crisis that young people are facing is really deepening and intensifying. And I think recently the U.S. Surgeon General released a really comprehensive report actually about the mental health crisis, like naming it as a crisis, a medical crisis that are affecting young people. So I for sure believe that when a more technology based form of education, whether it's like primary, secondary, higher education, it's going to be more isolating. I also think that it does things to our dopamine levels that are just bad. And I for sure believe that like the deeper we go into that hole of, screen-based education and living our lives on a screen, the more systemic problems we're going to see when you look at it from a mental health perspective. I'm sure you see that every day. I mean,
I do see it every day. I do see students who come to my virtual program and say, look, my anxiety is sky high. I can't be in the building. I can't be around, 1,000 kids or a class of 30 or whatever it is. But how are colleges, in your experience, how are colleges seeing this right now, or how are they even addressing it, or are they beginning to address it?
They're not. I mean, they're not. Like some schools are trying to reappropriate finances to beef up their student services departments. But the main thing I hear is that professors, especially in smaller school communities, are the ones who are having to pick up the emotional labor of being there for their students and kind of acting as therapists in a way for students who are hitting their first year in school and who are just flaming out and having a really difficult time, and trying to cope with depression, trying to cope with anxiety. So I do not think that, generally speaking, colleges and universities are doing a very good job of providing resources to mental health support, at least not in a way that is sort of appropriate or proportional to the extreme nature of the crisis that we're facing.
Are there examples, though, that you can point to of, let's say that I do have a child who, has heightened levels of anxiety. They come to you and say, hey, we want to talk about a college experience for my child. I have 3 teenagers right now, 1 who's deciding on her college and 2 who are obviously coming up and going to be looking at it. But what's I guess a good question to ask, of a college, or what's a question that you present that maybe helps to guide a student who maybe is dealing with a mental health crisis or anxiety or something along those lines that maybe gets them to a place where they're going to feel confident and safe and set up for success, not set up for failure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be helpful to investigate the written or unwritten policies that, like, honestly, like individual educators at a school have regarding, like, what do I do if a student needs to not appear in class for 2 weeks? Different schools have different cultures around how they treat like an episode where a student might be having a particularly hard time. Some might be have a complete tolerance policy where it's like whatever a student needs, that's what we're going to try to provide. Other schools might be a little bit more rigid and a little bit um, less understanding. So I would say that probably a lot of the time the best stakeholders to talk to about that, when you're exploring a school, probably not administrators, because for the most part, administrators, especially ones who are focused on enrollment and
Mm-hmm.
optics, are not going to be um, telling it like it is. That's a generalization. Someone might roast me for that. I don't know. I would say talk to teachers, right? Talk to professors. Professors have a totally different set of stakes, and they are very student centric, and they have the interests of students closest to mind,
Mm-hmm.
generally. And then I'd also say talk to students and try to get a barometer for the culture and climate at a particular school. And then finally, I would say definitely worth like exploring the mental health support, student services division of a
Mm-hmm.
university, and just try to get a sense, like, is this a chronically neglected part of the university infrastructure that is begging for more funding every year and never getting it, or is there support for a staff of mental health workers, of counselors who are doing what they can to help students?
And I would imagine too that your subreddit applying to college would probably be a good place to maybe ask these kind of questions, perhaps
Yeah,
sometimes.
for sure. It is good for that. Like if you're a parent or you're a student who's trying to learn more about a particular school, you can get a lot of helpful advice from this sort of hive mind.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Also, like Reddit more generally, if you go onto specific subreddits for, like, I don't know, our San Francisco State, there might be 2,000 students there who are involved in the student community who can kind of give you their quick temperature check. So that could be a good resource as well.
Yeah, I follow the Purdue University subreddit. That's my alma mater. It helps me keep tabs on. It's very interesting to be in that. It feels like if I was back on campus as a student, this would have been a valuable resource because it's not just camp. It's also the campus life and the things that are going on around, and the not just in the university, but in the
Yeah,
city of
the
West Lafayette
community.
around it. Yeah.
Totally. Totally.
And again, I know that people are probably saying, well, what does esports have to do with this or scholarships? But what I will say is, I can't tell you how many colleges reach out to us, and want to recruit our students, but I don't always feel educated enough to say, yeah, let me introduce you to my students, or I don't know if you're going to be a really good fit for some of my kids as well. So it's one of these things where we can't just say, oh, look, we have an esports program and now we want to invite your kids. It's important for us as teacher leaders to do our own research as well too, because we know, as you were alluding to with college professors knowing how they're going to react to mental health issues, we know our kids a lot better and where they may thrive and survive
Yeah,
a little bit better than the college may.
I think so. I think, you know, my perspective is that, as you put it, teacher leaders have very student oriented frameworks and goals. I think for the, I don't know for the most part, but generally speaking, I think teachers are teaching at least partly because they really care about student outcomes, and they are really protective and careful about their, their little community of folks that they're kind of taking care of and shepherding, right? Like through an education. And this is for sure true of like private companies, but even universities have very revenue driven incentives for recruiting in particular and enrolling. And I think that esports is at this intersection of new educational programs and models that a lot of universities are like making a lunge for, because they feel that they are a kind of 21st century sexy kind of recruiting tool. And just because an esports program is in place doesn't tell you very much at all about the supportiveness of the community, the resources that may be in that university community, the motives or the kind of model that an esports program director or coach is approaching with their recruiting. So I think in a lot of cases, the kind of incentives and the goals of, teacher leaders at the K-12 level and folks who are doing recruiting at the university level or who are leading programs, they can be misaligned. So it's just really important to think about and kind of do your homework, because that's where esports is. It's at this weird intersection of an enrollment crisis and new technology, and higher ed's in a weird spot right now, generally speaking.
Well, and again, you talked about at the beginning of our conversation here about your experience in World of Warcraft. You had to speak on your own private language almost just to talk about it in public. Yeah. But obviously colleges have shifted their perception, even though, as you are alluding to, they may not be aligned with everything else that they have other than beyond recruiting. And that's not the case for every program, we know. But how has the opinion or your opinion about video games in the last decade changed? Obviously, it feels more socially acceptable now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big question. I think that video games are so important, and they are also can be very destructive. And this is coming from, I feel like this is a credential check moment, but I've been playing video games since, really playing, a big serious gamer since I was, like a lot of people in the audience, right? 9 or 8.
5.
Yeah, right. As soon as my parents were comfortable buying me a PlayStation 1, I remember that's, Spyro the Dragon, throwing it back. And since then, been playing esports. I still play League of Legends, which I wish I didn't, but once you can't get out. And I've been totally addicted to video games at certain times in my life, and video games have also been a huge social saving grace and super constructive, super fun form of community. So it's hard. I think that on one hand, I'm loving that gaming is becoming more of a universally socially accepted space where resources are being dedicated. You're seeing real communities emerge. And I think that's really amazing when students can find community. Mm-hmm. And I think on the other hand, gaming addiction is a real thing. And gaming is in a lot of ways, I think, is the most epitomized version of the sort of minor addiction to screen that we all face. It's the most fun. It's the most...
well, it's intrinsically motivating. I wouldn't say it's so much addiction, but it is for some to feel a sense of autonomy and a sense of relatedness and a sense of competency. There's very few places that a lot of kids or young adults or even some adults who have regular jobs sometimes feel it too.
I agree. I totally agree with that. I mean, I do want to say though, I believe, I mean, and maybe you have, I do think that there is a space between, autonomy and self kind of feelings of self-actualization, community building, and just sort of the, dopamine oriented rush that, you
Mhm.
get from gaming that can be really hard to break away from.
Mhm.
And so I don't know. That's kind of a non-answer. I think that it's a really complex space, and I've personally have seen like so many amazing communities develop from it that I think it's like amazing that especially like scholastic gaming has taken off so much, and I feel like the leaders there, especially on like this individual like local school levels, have just like created this amazing world for students. I think gaming is complicated though. It's complex
Okay.
socially. Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for sharing with us this week about the experiences of working with you as what you see as the state of college, connecting that into gaming and esports, kind of pulling back a curtain a little bit, especially around mental health and the support services there. As we sign off on this week's episode, is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience, promotion of your work?
Um. Well,
There's McNeil Admissions.
that's my website. That's right.
Like McNeilAdmissions.com. And then there's the
McNeilAdmissions.com.
subreddit.
The subreddit. I just think that now is a good time to be paying attention really closely to mental health crisis. I think also the debt crisis in higher education, and not just higher. It touches students who are in K-12 right now, and helping students find resources to self-educate about gain some basic debt related financial literacy, is really important right now. I think that the debt crisis is one that we're going to be needing to find a solution to in the next few years, and that educators can do a lot of preventative work on before students make college decisions. And I definitely think, like, picking up on the theme you were getting at the beginning of this talk, like community college, right? Like state school educations. That's where a lot of my energy and hope lies for a way forward for students to be able to, get higher education, which is something that I think should be a universal human right if students want it, but to do it in a way that doesn't hamper them for the rest of their life financially.
Alex McNeil of McNeil Admissions and the moderator for the subreddit Applying to College. Thank you for being a guest on the Academy of Esports podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Really appreciate it.
That will do it for this week on the Academy of Esports. I've been your host, James O'Hagan. Esports are organized competitive video games allowing schools to redefine their athletic culture, diversify opportunities for student participation, promote good physical and mental health, increase collegiate scholarship pathways, and play games. We can never forget the importance of play. The mission of the Academy of Esports is to support these ideals. The vision of the Academy of Esports is for all students to experience the fun and joy of playing competitive video games. You may follow me on Twitter at Jim O'Hagan. That's at JIMOHAGAN, and through the Academy of Esports account at TAO Esports. It's a great way to get the latest blog posts, podcast episodes, and news coming out of esports and education. And remember, you can continue your engagement by going to www.taoesports.com. You can also connect through Facebook at www.facebook.com/TAO Esports. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to our time again next week.